about a minute, we'll be, are we on now?
You're live.
All right, in about 1 or 2 minutes, we'll start up. All right, so welcome to our Lyceum 2024. This will be our third Lyceum. Alex Gondola, who's here, did our intro, and he explained the history of the Lyceum. And he mentioned that it might have started in Greece. So when Susan and I did our program in Greece, we researched the Lyceum and we found out history about that. Tonight we've got Dave Nelson doing his program, and you can see from the screen what it's about. Next month we have Charlie Annan and Marcia Nelson doing a program on the Hutchinson Memorial group that they're forming, and I'll give you more information via email. We heard tonight from Chuck Worcester. Chuck, where are you? Chuck said that he has a Milford connection to this program, and he said he's going to wait and tell us later. So
I can't wait.
I can't wait either. Dave, you're on.
Thank you, Carl. So, Carl just said everything that I was going to say. So anyway, this story about the Steamboat Arabia, I've actually known about this for a number of years, and about the museum. And a few friends of mine, we got together, and we decided to take a road trip. And there was 5 of us in this RV, driven by this man. This is the man that owns the RV, and we wanted to go visit places in the south that since we were Civil War buffs, very much interested in Civil War history, but none of us had ever been to some of the major battles in the west and in the south. We've been to Gettysburg and Antietam, all kinds of places in Virginia. But we'd never been to like Shiloh, we'd never been to Chickamauga, we'd never been to Vicksburg and those places. So we said, well, let's do this trip, let's put together this trip. So we immediately nicknamed it the Grumpy Old Men Road Trip. So we did all of that. The first place we stopped was in Kansas City, where we saw the World War I Museum, which is absolutely amazing. And the next, in the same place, is the Arabian Museum. So, 3,700 miles in 9 days we did, and when we get back, we were still friends. So this entire presentation is from this one book here, which is called Treasures in a Cornfield, and it was written by Great Holly, and it was the Holly family that did all the research and searching for the actual site of the Steamboat Arabia, and they did all the excavation work, and they put together a museum. They cataloged and took care of all of the artifacts, 220 tons, I might add, 220 tons of cargo. I visited the museum in 2023, last year in March, with my friends in the Grumpy Old Men RV. So let's talk a little bit about the Steamboat Arabia. It's an average-sized Missouri River steamboat built at the shipyard of John Pringle along the banks of the Monongahela River in Brownsville, Pennsylvania, which is actually Pittsburgh. That gives you an orientation where it is. In 1853. It's 171 feet long, and a 54-foot beam, and a very shallow draft of 4.5 feet. Riverboats were designed for that very purpose because the river itself wasn't that actual deep in most places, 12 to 15 feet. It had a cargo capacity of 220 tons, and they completely filled that steamboat. There were 130 passengers on board. They had a capacity for 150. The Arabia had 3 boilers, 24 feet long, 3 feet in diameter, connected to a common header, and capable of generating 100 psi. That's a pretty high pressure for steam boilers in that time period, which were prone to explode in frequency. He had 2 steam engines with a 12-inch diameter piston and a 6-foot stroke connected to each of the paddle wheels. The paddle wheels themselves were 20 feet in diameter by 7 feet 6 inches wide. I might want to add here that for the most part, about 50% of the photos in here I took myself when I visited the museum. The others I took directly from Greg Holly's book, Treasure in the Cornfield. And I so noted those in the presentation as we went along. So I don't know if you were curious, as I was. I said, how does a steamboat built in Pennsylvania get to St. Louis, Missouri, and get to the Missouri River? Well, if you remember from your school days and studying history, what were the great movers of all of us in early America? It was the rivers everywhere, the Ohio, the Mississippi, the Monongahela, all of those. So here is here is where the steamboat was built in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And they traveled all the way down the Ohio River, all the way down the Ohio River. It's the border of Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, and also down through Indiana, all the way down to Cairo, Illinois. That's where it joins the Mississippi. So here you have Cairo, Mississippi, and then you have the Missouri River, which heads up in this direction. So from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Cairo, Illinois is 980 miles. Cairo, Illinois to St. Louis, Missouri is 150 miles. St. Louis, Missouri to Kansas City is 250 miles. This is on the river. And the total is 1,350 miles just to get to where they wanted that steamboat to be. During its lifetime, it made numerous trips up the Missouri River as far as Pierre, South Dakota, a distance of 734 miles. One traveler, George Withers, wrote this description. Persons desiring to take a trip per steamer upon the Missouri River, either up or down, would do well to meet the Arabian. We would strongly recommend her for speed and comfort. The table is supplied with all the luxuries desired, and everything fixed up in a most elegant style. We were on this boat 2 weeks and became acquainted with all the officers and crew and assured you that the person and property of passengers is perfectly safe aboard. Here are some photographs, this is from Greg Holly's book, of other steamboats, giving you some idea of the accommodations on board. You can see that tables, chandeliers, a table wall set, white tablecloths, fine china. And you could eat very well on board a Missouri steamboat. This is a menu from the Clara, which was a similar Missouri River steamboat, 1852. I probably can't see all the details on it, but they had roast beef, they had roast turkey, they had roast pork, they had roast venison, plus all the fixings, plus wine. You could travel in style aboard a Missouri River steamboat. In September 1856, the Arabia was carrying over 200 tons of cargo intended for general stores and homes in 16 Midwestern frontier towns. Now this is truly the frontier. Kansas was not a state. South Dakota was not a state. Nebraska was not a state, and neither was North Dakota. This is the extreme frontier of America. St. Louis and Missouri were the last outpost of what was then civilization for America. Beyond that, there were hostile Native Americans who were very much working very hard to prevent you from coming into their territory. So you could get into a lot of serious trouble out there in that area of the country. The steamer was fully loaded when it had its tree snag and sank just 6 miles west of Kansas City. This was not an unusual event. During the steamboat era, commerce on the river, during the era of steamboat commerce on the river, over 400 were lost due to encounters with snags. As the Arabia neared Cornfield, Missouri, the Arabia slammed in a snag lying just beneath the river's surface. The tree rips through the 3-inch oak planking, penetrating a full 10 feet and scattering cargo in all directions. Within seconds, the boat missed the port and began to fill with water. There was no loss of life. The boat drew 4.5 feet. The water was 12 feet deep. It just settled down into the river bottom, so all the passengers just went to the upper level, and they stayed there. It was within sight and hearing of Cornfield, Missouri, and the workmen heard the distress calls from the boat. So they got into their launches and they rowed out and they removed all the passengers from the ship, and there was no loss of life. There was no human loss of life. There was a mule whose owner had tethered it to a railing at the stern with its reins, and so it could not escape the rising water and drowned aboard the ship. So the river continued to assault the Arabia after the sinking. The strong currents and also debris, other snags, other trees were floating by, ripped off the smokestacks, which were 60 feet tall, by the way. It ripped off all the superstructure, and it ripped off the top of the paddle wheels. So that in just a matter of days, nothing was seen of the Arabia at all. So the nickname for the Missouri is the Great Muddy. Mark Twain is often credited with stating the Missouri River is too thick to drink and too thin to plow. Even today, if you take a glass of water and fill it up with Missouri River water and set it down, it will settle out to a thin layer of silt and scum on the bottom. So due to the erosion, the Mississippi River changed course over time, and the Arabia was buried underground for over a century, a half a mile from the original site where it sank is the present-day Missouri River. As you can see, this X marks the spot here. This is where the Arabia is. This was the original river. This is how it changed over 100 years. So now it lies in a big cornfield. So as the Missouri River was the demise of the Arabia, it also is what saved it. Because the extreme amount of silt in the water buried the contents quickly and shut off all the oxygen. And so it ended up encased in water, in silt, mud, and dirt, 35 feet deep for over 100 years. There were salvage attempts. In 1877, some people believe there were 400 barrels of Kentucky bourbon were part of the cargo, and they set out to try and get it. And they gave up. In 1897, another man, still believing that there were barrels of bourbon, constructed a caisson and extended from the surface to the deck. He abandoned it after finding a barrel of cork and chamber pots. So we fast forward to the Hollies. So in 1985, the Hollies started looking for the Arabia. Now, they grew up in this area. They grew up in Kansas City and environs. They heard all the local oral stories. They read all the newspaper accounts. They went to the archives in Washington. They finally determined where approximately the Arabia was. And so they get permission from the farmer who owned the cornfield. And they started doing, with a magnetometer, to locate the ship, and which was easy to do because all that iron was down there. You got 3 boilers, which are 28 feet long, and you got all the engines. There's a lot of metal down there. So then they started doing test borings. And the test borings they did completely outlined the boat. So now you can see, here's the outline of the ship as determined by the test borings. Here's the equipment. Gives you a really good perspective of how big it was and the vastness of this project. So the Hollies were perfectly aware of the fact the water table was very high in that area, so they knew that they were going to be dealing with water through this whole excavation project. So they got 30 horsepower motors powered by 3 diesel generators, operated 12 pumps, each having a capacity of 1,000 gallons per minute, pumping out water through 8-inch diameter pipes. They did this for 4 months. Their fuel bill was something like $500 a day. The family estimated initially that they could salvage the Arabia for $250,000. They invested $500,000, including another $150,000 from investors. By November, they had spent $650,000. This gives you an idea of the scope and magnitude of what they were dealing with. They're starting to excavate. The river is actually right there. There's the edge of it. It's about a half a mile away. This is them getting down. They finally got down to the actual ship itself, 45 feet down, digging this thing out, dealing with muck. And this is in the wintertime, by the way. Why are they doing this in the wintertime? Because the farmer who owned the field wanted to didn't want them to start until he'd harvested his corn, and he wanted it all done by the springtime so he could replant corn. So they did this in the winter, 4 months in the winter. There were brutal conditions for this salvage, muck, water, and mud. The entire Holly family was involved. There's some little ones here. They're all standing around in the mud and muck. The Hollies were very careful about recording the location of all the cargo that they found aboard the ship, and they made this schematic. I know you can't read it from where you are, but trust me, they've got every single thing that they recovered on this schematic. And also, it lines up with the ship manifest. So you can go and look at the ship manifest and actually see where this stuff was located in the ship. So this is just a partial list of some of the things on there. Door locks, 377. Nails, 1 million. Wood screws, 10,000. House keys, 200. Window panes, 700 window panes. 34,000 buttons, glass, rubber, wood, and bone. Writing pens, pen nibs, table knives, flintlock trade guns. Those were for the Indians, because although percussion rifles were readily available in 1850, they didn't want to sell those to the Indians. They only sold flintlocks to the Indians. Percussion boot pistols. That's just a portion of stuff. We'd be here for another hour if I listed everything that's on that manifest. And I'm going to eat some Missouri mud pie. And my wife and I'm standing between you and the mud pie, so we're going to get through this. So among the first items recovered were the engines and boilers. This gives you a perspective of how big the paddle wheel was, and this is the reach rod, and this is the connecting rod right here. This is my friend Greg Heppy. He's another one of the grumpy old men on the trip. This is how the boilers look like as they remove the muck from around them. This is what they look like today. This is the actual snag that sank the ship. It was still stuck inside the hull when they did the excavation work. You can see how big it is.
This is a museum too, right?
This is in the museum, right? So this is a revelation by Greg Holly. And he says that he calls in the book the moment he recovered one of the first items, and it was a pair of shoes, and not just any kind of shoe, it was a rubber shoe. And he turned it over, and he saw it marked with the patent, Goodyear's Rubber Company, 1849. Holly says at that moment, any thought of gold or silver meant nothing, and that this rubber shoe, along with all the other items underneath his feet, were the real treasure. By the way, the total amount of money found on the Arabia, 26 cents. But these things These shoes, marked and embossed with this beautiful eagle shield, very, very rare. Not even the Smithsonian has some of these things. They don't exist in any other museums. And they are kept in specially designed cases in the museum in an atmosphere of nitrogen. The other thing is that on the ship, the thing that amazed me most was the food and the clothing and textiles. Stuff that you would think of that would be so highly perishable that would never survive. Here are bolts of silk, wool, cotton, and yarn, and the colors are still vibrant 132 years after being underground. Clothing, men's clothing, socks, shirts. These are called miners' shirts. They have other names for them. They had a front placard on them. They were oftentimes red. Trousers, hats, boxes and boxes of hats. Here are all the bolts of cloth, all laid out and all arranged so that you can see them. Porcelain buttons from France and trade beads from Italy and Bohemia. Now, remember where I said where we were? Yeah. This is on the frontier of America, and yet they're able to get buttons from Europe. That's not the only thing they could get from Europe. Complete sets of imported English china. For those who could not afford imported English china on the frontier, there was tinware in abundance. Also cast iron cookware. Hofstadter's stomach bitters. You know, you can still buy bitters today. I don't know personally anybody that takes bitters, but you can still get bitters today. They don't come in bottles like that. These bottles still have the contents in them. I think the fact that why bitters are still popular is that they have a high content of alcohol in them. So, I think one of the most fascinating food items on the whole entire ship were these bottles of pickles. And this is from the book, and this is my picture. They keep all of the food that's actually original food inside bottles in very subdued light, kind of keep the degree of progression of slow it down somewhat. So, on January 4th, 1989, on the Ford cargo hold, a box was discovered that contains the bottles of bright green cathedral glass with labels that sweet pickles, Wells and Provost, 250, 217, and 219 Front Street, Wholesale Depot, New York. The pickles looked good enough to eat, so Jerry Mackey opened up one of the bottles, took out one of the pickles, sliced it off, and popped it into his mouth. As you can imagine, everybody else on the work team just sort of, you can kind of like picture this, where I gave him that he'd eaten this pickle. He said, it's still crispy and it tastes very good. They kept their eye on him very carefully for the rest of the day. He suffered no repercussions. By the way, that's stepping away from there. This is not from the Arabia, but this is a period 1850s pickle jar. Very different from what our pickle jars are today, with wide mouths on them. This is also, this has this aqua-colored glass, and the pickles were usually gherkins, or small pickles in there. Another thing that they sampled was they found a box, they have found several boxes of champagne actually. So one day they got tired of scumming around in all the muck and mud, and so they popped the contents of one of those and took a little drink of it, and it was still bubbly. Still had its effervescence. Medicines. The medicines for a variety of just different ailments. These are all the original contents of these medicine bottles. These are brandied cherries from France. Brandied cherries from France, I have to say it again, because this is the frontier. Pepper sauce and pie fillings of gooseberries, apples, blackberries, and cherries. I have a pepper sauce bottle, an original one right there. Didn't come from the Arabia, but that is an original pepper sauce bottle. Pepper sauce, what we buy today is Tabasco sauce. That was the first one. There were 5,000 pairs of boots and shoes on the Arabia of different kinds and styles. Here are some of them in full display. This is, it's absolutely incredible. More shoes. Even more shoes. There's 5,000.
Can you order these on Amazon?
There are padlocks with keys. This is a tap wrench. An indispensable tool for a blacksmith on the frontier. I actually have, when I saw it, when I was walking through the Arabia Museum, I said, hey, I have one of those. Oh, I have one of those too. And I got one of those. That's why I decided to put up this little mini exhibit of many of the items that I saw in the museum, and which I have at home. I really like old tools. I have an even bigger collection of this than what's on display here. This is the most amazing thing. A carpenter's wind-up tape measure from Sheffield, England. I didn't think they existed in that time period. There it is.
On the frontier.
Right, on the frontier. Fireplace tools. They look very familiar because they haven't really once changed much. Mechanics and wheel nut wrenches of assorted sizes. I've got some up here on the table if you want to look at them afterwards. Picks and shovels. Firearms. An eclectic mix of artifacts. This is a really busy photograph, but there's some things I want to point out to it. These are boxes of glass. These are bolts, or like machinery, or wagons or stuff. This is like raw material, like iron rods for like a blacksmith to make things out of. And over here are wheel nuts. There are things on here I actually can't identify. Those are doorknobs. I can't identify in this picture, but you get an idea of the incredible distribution and variety of stuff that was on board that ship. Hand saws and draw knives. Timber harvesting and sawmill tools. These are for up and down. These are shad belly crosscut saws, and this is for up and down sawmill. These are leather belts for machinery, and also pillow block bearings. More timber harvesting and sawmill tools. This is an amazing thing. There were 2 complete prefabricated houses on board the ship. And by measuring the dimensions of them, their joists and the other frame materials, they determined they were 16 by 20 feet. Well, it's not a very big house, but it's better than living in a tent or living in a log cabin on the frontier.
Or slot house.
And by the way, here is a period advertisement for some of those prefabricated houses. Vermilion was a dye. It was a popular color with Native Americans. Earlier you saw all of the trade feeds that were made to sell and trade with Indians. And the Indians really liked this dye, which was much easier to make than the dye that they used before their association with Europeans. There was so much stuff intended for general stores all along the river that they built a replica of a general store inside the museum. And they stocked it with all kinds of stuff so you could actually walk right in there, order stuff from, well, you couldn't because these were display items, but it gives you the idea that you could walk right up there and buy stuff in their general store. No, some of the things in this general store: matches, French perfume, marbles for children, a wide assortment of pocket knives, clay pipes, pen nibs. I think in that one of the slides I showed you earlier, how many pen nibs were there? Something like 450 or something like that. They just got a few of them out here. Pencils. Clothespins. Somebody was looking at the clothespins before this presentation started and said, "Hey, I remember my mother using these on clothes," and so do I. How many people remember these? Yeah. We still use them. That's how long they've been around. I'm not sure they're around now, but that's how long they were around in that time period. There were even patent spring clothespins. Here is the patent drawing. Here is one of those spring clothespins right there. They look a little different from modern spring clothespins, but they were spring clothespins. Whale oil lamps, door hardware, eyeglasses, fine china. The last item recovered from the Arabia was the stern section. That was on February 9th, 1989. Now, it's difficult to tell looking at this picture where that was on the ship. That's why I included this, but it's this section right here. Another view of the stern section from a different angle. Gives you a perspective. There's a person standing right here, 6 feet tall approximately. Don't forget that this thing drew 4.5 feet of water. Here's the actual rudder. Here's the rudder here. The Arabia's only casualty. When they were excavating the stern, they came across the poor mule who was still there, and he still had his halter on with his reins. Yep. So let's just kind of like recap here a little bit. 1853, the Arabia is built in Pennsylvania. 1856, Arabia sinks in the Missouri River. 1877, the first salvage attempt. 1897, the second salvage attempt. 1985, the Holly family begins searching. 1988, November, the excavation begins. 1989, excavation and recovery completed. And they had to, as an agreement, whoops, didn't mean to do that. As an agreement with the landowner, they were to put the property back to the way it was before they started excavating. And they did. They shut off all the pumps and it started filling up, and then they just backfilled all the dirt, all the muck and everything else that they took out, leveled it off, and so it's today still a cornfield. Conserving the artifacts. This is the only sad thing about this whole excavation. And the Holly's family, they had a desire and a commitment to preserve all of this stuff. And it was not met well with most American conservators. Their lack of credentials was met with abrupt dismissal. One conservator told them, "Open up the excavation sites, put everything back upon it. You and your associates have no business handling the collection. So their search for help led them to Norway, Iceland, Sweden, Germany, and England. They eventually ended up at the Mary Rose Ship Conservation Project in England. Now, you might not be aware of what the Mary Rose is. It was Henry VIII's pride and joy, his principal ship. It sank in the English Channel in 1545. It was recovered in the 1980s, just about the same time period as this one. Actually, I think a little bit earlier than that. And they were most helpful and recommended the Canadian Conservation Institute. And the Canadian Conservation Institute taught the Holly family about freshwater conservation and vital information about rust removal and protective coatings for metals, appropriate soaps and methods for cleaning textiles, and procedures for freeze-drying of wood and leather. So they built this huge tank here and lined it with plastic, and they put all the wood parts of the ship in there, including the two prefabricated houses. That was to keep them stabilized until they could actually treat them with preservatives in the laboratory. By the way, the Holly family is still working with all the artifacts. Their business was refrigeration. And so they had the capability and the know-how for freeze-drying artifacts, which is what they did. And many of those items are still in freeze-dry as we speak here tonight. So some of the appearance on the right here is a nail keg with the contents all fused together as it came out of the ground. So they had to deal with things like that and separate all those nails and get them all out, which they did. And they're still doing all of that today. So some of the takeaways from this story of the Steamboat Arabia. It's a time capsule of artifacts revealing an insight into life of mid-19th century America. There are items recovered from the Arabia that no other museum has in their collection, including the Smithsonian. More importantly, it destroys a lot of myths and preconceived notions about American frontier life. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, I would watch Westerns, and I would see these long lines of Conestoga wagons heading west to Oregon, and with really sullen-looking pioneers, trudging along beside them as they're going on this long trek. Well, and then when they got there, they built crude cabins, and if they didn't make it as far as Oregon, well, they might have stopped in Kansas and Nebraska and made a mud house or something like that. Well, I'm sure that it did exist in Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, but clearly, as soon as they were capable of doing it, they abandoned all that. They built houses. They wanted stuff from back east. They wanted stuff from Europe. They wanted all those things. You can always imagine. You can always imagine a wife saying to us, "All right, you want to move to where?" I said, "All right, we can go there, but I want all the niceties that I'm used to here. Fine china, French perfume, blah blah blah." Didn't have flush toilets. So it truly was a frontier America in the 1850s. Keep in mind, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, and North Dakota had not yet achieved statehood. But this last photograph, the next to last photograph, this is the Holly family. I think this is a 1980s photograph. The children are much older now. But I put it in there because of all of their fantastic work they did in excavating this, and also building that museum where all those artifacts are. This is the Steamboat Arabia Museum in Kansas City. If you ever are, in fact, I'm going to make it a destination trip. We did, with a grumpy old man. If a grumpy old man can do it, you can do it too. But, so, that's where it is. If you're there, go visit the Steamboat Arabia Museum. It'll blow your mind. I've only shown you a very small portion of what was in that museum. I made an attempt to make a mock museum here of some of the items in my own personal collection that I know were identical to the kinds of things that were on the Arabia. Questions? So, yes?
Did they actually find any bourbon?
Anyone?
Any bourbon? I mean, that would have been... Bourbon.
No, there was no bourbon. There was several cases of champagne and one case of cognac. That was it. Yes?
So is the museum under and run and operated now by a trust, or is it run and operated only by the whole family, or a combination?
I think both of those things. I think the Holly family still has their fingers involved in that, but yeah, I don't think they could have a museum of that magnitude by themselves. So yes, I believe that both of those things are true still. Any other questions?
In your reading, what spurred them on to do this? The thought? Yeah.
Oh, that's a good. So Greg Holly says when he was growing up as a boy, he heard all these stories about sunken steamboats on the Missouri River, and he dreamed about. He read Treasure Island, you know, like everybody did. We read Treasure Island. You think about finding treasure, things like that. So that's really what. And it never left him. So when he got to be an adult, that's what he wanted to do. And like he says, the real treasure was not in money. It was all those artifacts, which are one of a kind in many cases. Yes, Bob.
Are there other steamboats that may have been there that we don't know where they are?
Oh yeah, they did a search. They came up with a list of steamboats that were potential excavation sites. And they slowly eliminated all of them until they get down to the Arabia, which for reasons that they thought it's most likely right here. They knew almost right exactly where it was, within a half a mile. So things like that. Yes?
I can't believe they did that excavation in 3 months.
4 months, but yeah.
Could they have left some artifacts behind?
I'm sure that they left something behind, but I think they did a pretty thorough job of
Looks like it.
bringing that stuff out of there, yeah.
Did they say how many people worked on that excavation?
I never got a number for that. It was the Holly family plus a lot of associate members, you know, family friends and things like that. They did that.
Do it in 4 months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To set up all that machinery, pump out all that water, and keep pumping it out for 4 months. Yeah. Yes.
Out of curiosity, I know in ocean-going vessels that have been brought up like that and just found that the contents belong to usually the state. I'm curious how this
Yes.
works that.
Okay, so if the Arabia was still sunk in the Missouri River, I'm sure there would have been all kinds of regulations, federal and otherwise, that would have prevented or made it much, much difficult for them to excavate. But the fact it was on private land and the owner gave his permission and they entered into a contract, that's how they get to do it. No problem. Yes, any other questions? Now, don't forget that it's Missouri went high. Huh?
Did you hear Chuck's story yet?
No, yeah, Chuck, but first I want to just say this, that I have to give credit for Pat, my wife, who has been busy, and she's not even out here, she's in there, getting stuff ready for us to eat, and so just want her to recognize her and for all her efforts. Tell us the story with the Milford connection.
In a earlier trip of the
Grumpy old man.
Arabia, it was at a time
when Kansas was going to enter the statehood, and if you're a student of the abolitionists and so forth, there was a time when Kansas was being decided, when it was going to come into the
Leading Kansas,
leading Kansas.
pro-slavery and anti-slavery factors.
Beecher, down in Massachusetts, was an abolitionist, and he wanted to, the only way that they felt that they could get control of the state was to drive out the slavers. So how do you drive them out? With a gun. So Beecher goes to the Springfield Rifle Company, Armory, and buys hundreds and hundreds of rifles. Packs them in boxes named Beecher's Bibles. Because it was illegal to ship them overland or anyway. But they were going to do it. They were going to arm the people, the abolitionists that were in Kansas, to drive out the slavers. Now, the rifles are all put aboard this ship. Partway on its way towards Kansas, on Missouri, an inquisitive crew member opened one of the cases and discovered the rifles. The ship's captain immediately pulled over, or pulled the ship to the next dock, unloaded everything, and they arrested the guys that were on it for transporting armament. And yet, all of these rifles are breech-loading rifles. There were no breeches in them. The breeches had been sent overland. So they never were able, the law was never able to make it stick that they were transporting weapons. And guess who was transporting the breeches? None other than Calvin Cutter.
Oh, really? From Milford?
From Milford.
Dr. Cutter?
Dr. Cutter,
Right.
who continued to stay in Kansas, in that area, for almost a year as a head of a militia group.
So, yes. So you mentioned Springfield rifles, but on board the ship there were several boxes of these,
But
which are Sharps rifles. This was the leading edge in firearms technology in the 1850s. And these were going there. In fact, the United States Army did not abandon muzzleloaders until 1873. So the advantage of this is a breech loader.
Okay.
You load it right here, put a cap on there, and you're ready to go. And there were several boxes of those on that ship. So, a different cargo, I mean a different voyage, but they're still doing that. Yeah.
And I was just in Kansas City a month ago, and if you had told me what you told me tonight, and I knew it then, I would have gone. Instead, I had Vietnamese food that
I'm
night.
crushed. Okay, so anyway, does anybody else have any other questions? I'll be up here at the top. Yes.
Just all that stuff that you have on the table, is that from the actual? No.
None of it. It's all from my personal collection.
Oh, okay.
But like I said, as I was going through that museum, I was looking at stuff, I said, I have one of those. I have one of those too, and I have one of those. And so I've been collecting tools and stuff.
Yeah.
Ask my wife. For years.
Are you
So-
eccentric?
Am I eccentric? Oh, absolutely. So anyway, so I put together this stuff. It's kind of like that mini Arabian museum.
Okay.
So you get a kind of like a feel of you're actually seeing stuff rather than just seeing it on a slide.
So give Dave a round of applause. So, those who are able, if you could help us put the chairs on the rack.